Okay, hello, and welcome back to the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, where we bring you friendly neighborhood history 24/7, 365, or 366. And as promised, I am doing a tier list, and this is my tiers of U.S. presidents based on the format. I think this was originally created back in like 2023, 2024, when there were only 46 presidents listed. And I will be ranking all presidents until George W. Bush, 2009. Maybe do Barack Obama as well. The reason I'm not going to do all of them is because with Donald Trump still coming back to office for being the second president ever for a non-consecutive term, just like Grover Cleveland, it's going to be kind of hard to assess exactly where he was in the presidential landscape. And Joe Biden was already president just recently, so it's hard to judge presidents in more recent time periods from Bush onward. So judging Bush and Obama will be more on the difficult scale, and obviously their legacy and their impact as presidents is still unfolding. But I'm going to go in consecutive order, and so of course that starts with George Washington. So I'm going to put George Washington in the S tier. I think he's right up there as one of the best presidents ever, and there wouldn't be an office of the presidency without George Washington. He created the cabinet system. He created the standard of the president only serving 2 terms. He used the commander in chief uh, position to basically put down the Whiskey Rebellion and enforce the excise tax in Pennsylvania in 1794. Obviously, there would be no United States or American system without George Washington. He was the leader of the Continental Army, the leader of the Constitutional Convention, and the office of presidency, including the presidential power of commander in chief, was totally built around George Washington. So you can't have an American president or an American presidential system without George Washington. So he's going to be in the S tier for that. Obviously, these judgments are based mainly on their presidential accomplishments and their presidential legacies. I'm not judging them completely as people. Obviously, I want to acknowledge that George Washington, like many of the early presidents, owned and was okay with slavery in many ways, and that is totally unacceptable. And it doesn't make him an S tier person, but his presidential accomplishments and the fact that the presidency itself is completely based on George Washington and was completely all of its goalposts were set by George Washington definitely makes him an S tier president, in my opinion. He's probably my favorite chief executive, but favorite and best are not the same thing, and we'll talk about that later. On to the next president, John Adams, the second U.S. president, as I get rid of this pesky little ad here. Obviously, more of a better founding father than he was a president, kind of an arrogant, stubborn guy who really didn't listen to advisors, but I would say that he is a C tier president. A much better founding father than he was a U.S. executive. He kept America from going to war with France, even though all of the Federalists in his party wanted to. He created the American Navy, but his Alien and Sedition Acts, which attacked free press and freedom of speech, really hurt his presidential legacy compared to his predecessor and his successor. So John Adams, while doing some good, obviously did some bad, and usually the average ones end up in the C tier. So next up is Thomas Jefferson, obviously another person who is not exactly an S tier individual. You look at what he did with Sally Hemings and his refusal to free his slaves even after his death, like Washington, a slave owner. It was actually John Adams was the only one of the first 5 presidents who are called the founding presidents who did not own slaves and fought hard against slavery, helping to create the Massachusetts abolitionist organization. But Thomas Jefferson, obviously not an S tier person, not an S tier president either, but he is definitely up there for me, and I'm going to put him up here in the A tier. Thomas Jefferson, definitely an A tier president. The Louisiana Purchase, double the size of the United States. Jefferson sold off most of American debt by just selling off public lands to private individuals, and had this vision of American kind of as a place for liberal democracy that is still popular amongst right wingers, conservatives, and libertarians especially. So definitely set the political trends in America. And one of the most fascinating presidents. What keeps him from the S tier is his dreadful Embargo Act, which really hurt the American economy as he was trying to keep America out of war between Britain and France. So so these are the first 3 presidents. Most people know who those are. The next one is James Madison. And again, James Madison, like John Adams, is a president, as I'm going to put him in the B tier, who is better as a founding father than he is as a president. Obviously, this guy helped create the U.S. constitutional system. He wrote the Bill of Rights. He helped write the Federalist Papers. You wouldn't have an American system without these 4 individuals I just have mentioned. And Madison was a good president in the sense that he knew how to follow the Constitution. America was pretty prosperous after the War of 1812, but what keeps Madison from being considered a great president and I think he's better than John Adams, but I'm actually going to bump him down to C tier, is the fact that he went into the War of 1812 knowing that the English had the best army in the world, knowing that the British had them totally outgunned and outmanned and outmaneuvered, and the losses in Canada, the losses along the Chesapeake Bay, the burning of the White House, the fact that him and his wife were forced to flee, makes it really, really sad. So James Madison, a really good founding father with the Constitution, and America was, after the war, in a pretty good spot. And basically being able to walk away with no punishment from the English is definitely an accomplishment. But Madison is not as great of a president as he was a founding father. Now, we come to one of my favorite presidents, and one of the first president who I will put in the underrated tier if I could make. Well, I could make one, but I didn't make one. I'm just going with the letters for now. But if there was an underrated tier, James Monroe is definitely at the top. And I'm going to put him at... Ooh, it's hard. I almost want to put him in A tier. I might go back and change this, actually, because it's very much James Monroe, the fifth president, the last founding father president, served in the American Revolution, obviously, like Jefferson and Madison, a slave owner. But, I mean, really, nothing went wrong when James Monroe was president. Everything went right. America was expanding. Its infrastructure was building. America got Florida, thanks to the actions of Andrew Jackson. The Missouri Compromise seemed to solve the slave issue for a while and brought down simmering tensions in the Union. Maine became a free state, Missouri became a slave state, and it really set up how the Louisiana territories would be determined, with those north of a certain line being slave and those south of a certain line. I think it was the 34th parallel or something, being slave states. Monroe stood up, was the first president to speak for all of the Western Hemisphere. With the Monroe Doctrine, which basically tried to ban Britain and France and the rest of the Europeans from colonizing the New World. And that set it was the first time America cracked open into foreign policy, and did so quite successfully. The only time that failed was when the French took over Mexico in the 1860s, but we were involved in the Civil War. So there was an A- tier, I put him there, so I'm going to shift him up to the A tier. I mean, James Monroe, highly underrated president. America was prosperous, successful, peaceful, and Monroe got a lot of important things done that kept America progressing forward. Again, not necessarily an S-tier individual, but an A-tier president. Okay, John Quincy Adams. This is the idea of high ideals, as I get rid of yet another pesky ad. This is high ideals, basically not getting high results. John Quincy Adams, like his father, was extraordinarily stubborn, bullish, and would not listen to his advisors. And because he was accused of cheating in the 1824 election, he refused to have his political allies in high-ranking positions so that people would see him as honest. But this came back to bite him in the butt, because thanks to the man that comes right after him, Andrew Jackson, his sworn political enemy, his presidency was extraordinarily unsuccessful, because the Democrats, as Jackson's followers came to be known, made his presidency, his American system, building canals, highways, and things like that, really hard to accomplish. I'm going to put him in D tier. He really didn't get a lot done when he was president, and it really, really shows when you look at a guy like John Quincy Adams, not even as successful as his father. What John Quincy Adams was great at was fighting slavery. He's the only U.S. president to be elected to the House of Representatives after his presidency. And he actually does an excellent job of fighting slavery. Obviously, the Amistad, which became a famous movie, is based off of his actions in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served until his death in 1848. So a man, once again, like Madison, like Adams, but not as successful, judged on his successes after the presidency. Okay, people are not going to like this, but I think Andrew Jackson is an overrated American president and really deserves a lot of high criticism. And so I'm going to put him in the C tier. No one has advanced the American exceptional vision like Andrew Jackson, and I think it's a pretty incredible accomplishment that he paid off all of America's debts. But the Trail of Tears is a horrendous action by the American government, and even though the Supreme Court tried to stop him from doing it, Jackson refused to listen to them. Sound familiar? Anyways, so yeah, I really like Andrew Jackson in some ways. Obviously, this bold, incredible commander from the War of 1812 who wins the Battle of New Orleans, conquers Florida, just bullish and stubborn and just wanted his way, destroyed the American economy by defrocking the Bank of the United States, the system Alexander Hamilton had successfully created to handle America's financial structures. Jackson has a vision just like Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson thought that Andrew Jackson was extremely dangerous. So Jackson's overrated. There's a lot of presidents who are over and underrated. And Jackson was so popular, though, with the common man that that's why a lot of people have considered him the American president, or one of the best American presidents. I don't think he deserves the $20 bill. I don't believe he deserves the Jacksonian era named after him. But when you think of white chauvinism and pioneers and manifest destiny, Jackson set the basis from that by his policies that advocated for small government and individual rights in the 1830s. One thing that he did incredible that keeps him from being lower on the tier list, believe it or not, because of all of his heinous actions during his presidency, Jackson paid off all U.S. debt and is the only president to ever be debt-free. Following the pattern of Thomas Jefferson, he sold off government land to do this. So, moving right along, and I know this is going to be a long video, so I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen and everything. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of history and want to hear more from the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. So, the next guy on the list is Martin Van Buren. By the way, I am just going to get rid of E tier. There is no E tier. We're going to go classic alphabet, and we are going to... or actually, I am going to add. Sorry, I know I'm cheating here, but I'm going to add back E tier, and here's why. As I fiddle around with this, sorry guys, my first time ever doing this. It's a lot of fun. So, and NA, not applicable, and you'll see why in a minute. Why I have the NA list, and I'm going to put that below F. But Martin Van Buren is definitely a failed politician and a failed president. Not exactly one of the worst. You won't believe how many presidents get on the F tier, but the guy who was a really smart politician, created the Democratic Party, and was basically Jackson's whipping boy, and enforced the Trail of Tears, enforced the closure of the Bank of the United States, and ruined the American economy for this, had no real answers, and basically took his lumps as being this rich, fancy boy while Americans were suffering, and had no answers for the Panic of 1837, and because of that, he gets... He is going to be my first F-tier president, but certainly not the least, or the last. And he's not the worst president ever. There's going to be a lot of presidents in F-tier, and a lot coming up real soon. Okay, so the NA category really exists for just this guy, William Henry Harrison, the 9th president, who was only president for a month before he died in office, and he really didn't do anything. The rumor that he got sick from his long inaugural address, which I used to believe, is actually not true. He actually got cholera, which other presidents have gotten, but... yeah, William Henry Harrison, definitely not a great U.S. president, but really didn't have a chance. He was 68 years old. He only served for a month, and then he died. His wife never even really made it to become First Lady. And because of that, we can't really judge him. It's not really fair. A lot of people say he's a failure, but that's not his fault that his health failed on him. It's not his fault that he got sick. So, John Tyler, another president to join the F tier. John Tyler was so unpopular as president with the Whig Party that they kicked him out of their party, and he is the president without a party. And when you basically tick off both political sides so much, the Democrats and the Whigs, he refused to sign legislation that he originally had said he would do. It really puts you in a bad position. Tyler's greatest accomplishment is he is the one who approved the annexation of Texas because he didn't care about the slavery issue. Van Buren refused to do it, and that's the only thing that Tyler gets to his name. So I'm going to put him a little bit ahead of MVB, but definitely not a great president, and then became a Confederate traitor and died in Confederate Congress in 1862. He believed strongly in that Jeffersonian, Jacksonian idea, but his inability to govern steadily really was a problem. I will move him up to D, though, because he's actually the first president to ascend to the presidency because another president died, and he refused to take any flack from people who wanted to bully him, and he asserted that an ascendant president who gains the White House because the president dies is a president and should be treated like the president and act like the president. So that boldness set a precedent or a standard for future succeeding presidents, and some of them are the greatest presidents in our history, and that wouldn't have been possible without John Tyler asserting himself. So because of that, I'm going to move him up to D tier. but not a great president other than that, and maybe the annexation of Texas. Okay, we go from bad presidents to a highly underrated president, James K. Polk, like my guy, James Monroe, a very highly underrated president. And James Polk did more in 4 years than most presidents do in 8, and some would argue FDR did in 12. Polk basically completed Manifest Destiny, Sea to Shining Sea, got the Oregon Territory with Great Britain, settled that latitude line, because before then the British and the Americans would share Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia, and so that was finally settled under James K. Polk and his presidency. And then he went to war with Mexico on a flimsy excuse over a border dispute in Texas to acquire California and the Southwest, and he did all of this in just a short amount of time. Some people have criticized him promoting the slavery issue. The real truth of the matter is that Polk, more than any other president, wanted to expand America. He believed very strongly in Jackson's ideas, and is perhaps the most Jacksonian president ever, more so than Jackson himself. And is definitely underrated. And he's not A tier because he really didn't really give a fig about the slavery issue when it was clearly becoming an issue that would be pretty divisive after he left office. And by getting all those new territories, that inflamed slavery debates and leads to our next president, Zachary Taylor. So Zachary Taylor didn't do much. He's almost an NA tier in my opinion. And it's tough. I want to put him in NA tier because he really didn't do much. He was only president for a year. He died in office. Once again, you can't blame him for that. Taylor does get some credit, in my opinion, because in the growing slavery debate, he actually decided that he was not going to accept the South seceding from the Union. He threatened to hang anyone who would leave the Union, including his own son-in-law, Jefferson Davis, who was the future president of the Confederate States of America in the Civil War. So Zachary Taylor didn't take crap from anyone, much like Andrew Jackson, who also threatened to hang secessionists, which is a point in his favor as well. So I think for that matter, and that matter alone, Zachary Taylor is one of those C-minus students, C-minus presidents, if the presidents were students. He doesn't really do anything. He was lazy. He was not really an active president, but it would have been interesting to see how he kept the Union together as a Unionist in the wake of the slavery debate. And he refused to sign the Compromise of 1850, which was a disaster for his successor, Millard Fillmore, who is definitely a D-tier president. Fillmore becomes president. He's an ascendant president. The only thing that's saving him from an F tier is that he basically operated under this notion that he could keep the Union together, but like John Quincy Adams, his ideas were totally out of kilter, and were not achievable. America was way too divided on the slavery issue, and even the great compromiser Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the great orator, could not keep the Union together with the Compromise of 1850. And by Fillmore signing the Millard Fillmore signing the Fugitive Slave Act, which was part of the Compromise of 1850, that inflamed passions in the North, led to the rise of the Underground Railroad, and probably indirectly caused the Civil War. So, as difficult as it was for Taylor and Fillmore to deal with the slavery issue, it was even worse for the next guy, Franklin Pierce, who is definitely an F-tier president. Franklin Pierce basically turned Kansas and Nebraska by getting rid of the Compromise of 1850 and allowing the territories to decide for themselves whether they wanted slavery or not. He turned those areas into a bloodbath as pro-slavery forces ran into Kansas and Nebraska to start fighting. Pierce was weak and bullied. The only real accomplishment, he completed the continental United States with the Gadsden Purchase, but being manipulated and refusing to make a firm stance on slavery and trying to please everybody, he ended up pleasing nobody. And his Kansas-Nebraska Act led to Bleeding Kansas. It led to basic quasi-warfare before the Civil War between pro-slavery and pro-abolition forces in places like Kansas and the Nebraska territories. So definitely one of the worst presidents in American history. Had a drunk driving accident when he was president, and I feel bad. Yeah, I gotta feel bad for him in some ways. This poor man who suffered with alcoholism and his wife's mental illness, depression, lost his son in a horrific train accident right before he became president, and was not in the right mental state to be president. And maybe if America hadn't been engaged in such tense issues over slavery, Franklin Pierce might have been a decent president in another world like Millard Fillmore. But even worse than Fillmore, he could not solve this issue at all. And a man who not only could not solve the issue but made it worse is, I think, in retrospect, the worst American president, James Buchanan. I mean, it doesn't get much worse than basically ignoring the Dred Scott decision, ignoring Kansas wanting to enter as a free state, trying to force them to accept slavery, basically believing that the South can do whatever it wants. And when they secede from the Union after Lincoln is elected, in his lame duck session, Buchanan does nothing to stop them. Um, and really, I mean, other than the fact that he threw lavish parties in the White House, that's basically the only good thing you could say about him. And that was thanks to Harriet Lane, his niece. But Buchanan, just despite tons of president experience, just did nothing to solve the slavery issue and only made things worse. The Dred Scott decision is one of the worst in Supreme Court history. The Kansas Constitution is one of the worst, and just ignoring the clear signs of growing civil war by allowing 7 U.S. states to leave and form the Confederate States of America because you think slavery is protected by the Constitution. I'm sorry, that's just sad. So presidents, as you can see, are just getting worse and worse since Polk's ascendancy. But fortunately, we have the best American president, and I'm only putting him there because I have to scroll up. But Abraham Lincoln is easily, I think, and I'm going to, yeah, there you go. So, in my opinion, Abraham Lincoln, and I think most people agree with this, is the gold standard of U.S. presidents. Winning the Civil War, freeing the slaves, the Homestead Act, even the Transcontinental Railroad, the things that Lincoln did domestically besides the Civil War, despite the fact that his presidency was totally consumed by the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, the 13th Amendment, all of these things. Lincoln's domestic policies of homesteading and things like that ended up helping blaze the frontier and make America populous and more wealthy and prosperous. It would have been very fascinating to see Abraham Lincoln in peacetime and the Reconstruction program that Lincoln had that would have been extremely favorable to African Americans after slavery ended, but also allowed the South to come back in. The program that he had might have brought racial harmony to this country a lot sooner, or at least close to it, and Lincoln would have definitely embraced the 40-acre and a mule reparations of the radical Republicans and probably found a way to enact it. So Lincoln, the fact that Lincoln dies is one of the most tragic what-ifs in history, and for me it's the most fascinating. But obviously, winning the Civil War, carrying that weight personally, spiritually, and emotionally. You look at any president they all age tremendously in the White House, but Lincoln aged more than any of them because the weight and pain of 600,000 men dying on his soul is just, there's a spiritual element to Abraham Lincoln that we don't get with other presidents. It's almost like an aura. So that's why Lincoln, for me, is the runaway choice for the S tier. And going back down the list, we go to Andrew Johnson, who isn't as bad as James Buchanan, but that's not saying anything. He's the most racist president we've ever had. He basically just pardoned Confederate officers, refused to enforce the Freedmen's Bureau or support any sort of programs in the South to help African Americans receive education, economic opportunities, or finding their families. And basically, the Republicans in Congress had enough of a majority basically to overturn his vetoes on all of their programs because Johnson basically believed that Southern whites should be allowed to do whatever they wanted as long as the slaves went free. And this man was a slave owner himself and the last U.S. president, there's one more, who owned slaves. And by the way, the vast majority of these men owned slaves. Lincoln did not, obviously. Van Buren was opposed to. I don't think he owned it, and the Adams. But most of these other men were slave owners in one way or another, or at least perfectly okay with it. So Johnson, only for political reasons, abandoned his love of slavery, but he didn't abandon his racist ideas. And yes, of course, you could argue that all of these men so far have had racist ideas. It's very, very true that Lincoln believed blacks should be sent back to Africa because he didn't believe they were educated enough to survive in the American South. But he became more and more open to more and more civil rights and full inclusion as the Civil War went on. So Johnson is just dogged, stubborn, refuses to work with the Republicans, pardons Confederate officers, and because of his inaction, the Ku Klux Klan starts to rise up, and it gets so bad that for political reasons, but also because of his own stubbornness, he gets impeached and barely survives that. He's the first U.S. president to be impeached by the Senate. So next we go to a president who gets a lot of bad rap for various different reasons, and that's Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is usually judged on his military record, But as a president, he doesn't get the credit he deserves because of the corruption of his administration. A lot of people would put him in D tier. I'm going to put him in C tier ahead of Taylor. And the main reason I'm going to do that, in my opinion, and let's put Jackson ahead of John Adams. So Ulysses S. Grant got rid of the Ku Klux Klan, got the 14th and 15th Amendments. Definitely he deserves credit for that and for working, or the 15th Amendment. I think the 14th Amendment was already there when he got there, but Grant did everything in his power to succeed with Reconstruction, but his political corruption led to him losing political power in Congress and failing to get the protections for African Americans that he desperately desired. And if Grant is a case example of good ideas, good activity, but a terrible judge and character, the Credit Mobilier scandal, the whiskey scandal, all of these people in his administration which were just full of corruption, the patronage system where you basically picked your friends or relatives of your family to be in political positions, that sort of favoritism and nepotism only spells disaster when corrupt and politically inefficient people get into power. And Grant himself was never corrupt, but he couldn't deal with that. But the corruption ruined what he was trying to do. He also had an economic panic that he didn't know how to handle. So for that, he's in the C tier. Okay, another C tier president is Rutherford Hayes, and I hesitate to put him in the C tier. He's almost a D tier president for me. The most important thing he's pretty meh. He had a lot of good ideas, wanted to do right, and believed that by agreeing to end Reconstruction, that the Confederates in the South would go along with his program for civil rights. He didn't do that. He is the first president to travel to the West. He did what he could to upend the political corruption in both political parties, but he's relatively ineffective. So he's a very meh president. Okay, another president who gets into the NA tier, but is a better president because he was there longer than William Henry Harrison, is James Garfield. Garfield was only president for 6 months. He opposed the patronage system and seems like he probably would have found a way to solve it. But because he refused to give a position to a man named Charles Guiteau, Guiteau went raving mad and shot him. Garfield was in rehabilitation for several months. His doctors could not solve the problem, and they only made it worse by infecting him through different surgical procedures in his back, trying to extract the bullets in his ribs, I believe they were. And Garfield died 6 months into office. A very big tragedy for an otherwise decent fellow, who was a little bit of a philanderer, by the way. But again, I'm trying not to judge these men on their personal characteristics, and I probably need to speed it up because how long have we been going? Yeah, we've been going for a half an hour. Wow, this is going to be a long video. So, yeah, you do not have to watch all of this. But I hope you do. Chester Arthur. So here's a guy who's like a little underrated. This guy's interesting. And while I'm here, the more I think about Jackson's ability to get rid of the U.S. debt, I have to put him in B tier. When I think about how presidents were all very racist at that time, I'm going to move him up from C plus to B minus. Give us a little more space in the B tier because Jackson's success is his ability to change the American political and social landscape. You can't just say he's a mediocre president at that point. But he still is overrated, and still the Trail of Tears is on him. Chester Arthur. So this guy, who I really like, was kind of the lazy bones of the presidents. His indolency kept him from being a successful president, but he might have been elected to his own term if he had not had a horrible kidney disease. Arthur fixed the civil service program by putting in the civil service reforms that he wasn't supposed to do because he was a corrupt bureaucrat. He liked to go partying. He redecorated the White House. He would stay out walking the streets of Washington, D.C. till like 2 o'clock in the morning just talking, and he would sleep till 10. He didn't get a lot done, but his reformation of the American Navy would be extremely important for the 19th and 20th centuries. The Chinese Exclusion Acts, however, were a big problem for him, and something that him and Rutherford Hayes were observing but not doing a lot about was not only discrimination against African Americans running rampant in the South, which would lead to segregation and Jim Crow laws, but Arthur also noticed but didn't do much to stop. They did pass the first antitrust laws, I think, when he was president. the growing power of the robber barons who owned, in the Gilded Age, a huge percentage of the wealth and a huge percentage of the business, and could just dominate the fields, not giving proper wages, sanitation, or rights to their workers, while also controlling the prices of the market. So Arthur didn't do enough to stop that. Didn't get involved there, didn't put any brakes on that, and it would be up to his successors to do that. So here's a guy, Grover Cleveland. This guy is interesting to me. And you notice there's a lot of presidents in the middle. The median is always kind of there at the C tier. The presidents are kind of meh, and I feel like I'm doubling up too much on the C tier. But he's going to go in the C tier too. And here's why. He's the only, first president until Trump was the only president to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. He gets a B. He gets a B in his first term. His only failure, America was stable. He took Congress, which was way too powerful, to hilt by vetoing a bunch of legislation. The country was economically prospering, but his inactivity in the face of an economic panic in his second term would put his second term in the D tier. So because of that, I'm throwing him in the C tier. Here's another D tier president, Benjamin Harrison. Really kind of favored those robber barons, kind of let them do whatever he wanted, and embraced the McKinley tariffs, thinking that they would solve the economic woes of the early 1890s, and they really didn't do much to help that at first. The protectionism of the Republican Party in the wake of growing global markets was not working the way it had in previous decades, and so the economy was really not great under Benjamin Harrison, and it caused some problems for Grover Cleveland when he came back. Harrison did try what he could to help African Americans. He oversees an America that is growing wealthier, but his spending, his affects and hurts the economy. The populist movement is gaining steam, and Harrison's support of big businesses when bimetallism has become extremely important. And his ignorance over the plight of the common people, like Grover Cleveland, hurt him in the late 1880s, early 1890s. So, it's been a while, but we're back to a very underrated president, and that is Mr. William McKinley. And he would be like an A- president. McKinley fixed the American economy, put America on the imperial map by defeating and destroying the Spanish Empire in the Spanish-American War, brought America into the 20th century proud and prosperous, and I agree with the opinion that he would have made it to Mount Rushmore instead of his successor had he not died and been shot in office just into his second term. McKinley's a total Chad when it comes to his personality, by the way. His wife was so sick that he stayed home, like many candidates did, but refused to campaign because he wanted to tend to her. She had epileptic seizures. So one of those presidents who definitely understood the time he was living in and what he could and could not do. He also had a plan to bring civil rights to African Americans, but was killed before he could enact it. But his successes in the Spanish-American War are really, really quite impressive, and people just don't pay attention to him because he's seen as a stepping stone to a greater president who is next on the list. And that's true to some extent. But William McKinley, don't laugh at him, don't gawk at him. America was proud, prosperous, and successful under him. The one thing he gets a stain on his legacy is the annexation of Hawaii, which was a total abuse of the Hawaiian people, which obviously we don't talk about enough, but Sanford B. Dole and the sugar barons basically controlling that and demanding that Harrison and then Cleveland annexed them, and it was McKinley who annexed them against the will of the vast majority of Hawaiian people who had lost the right to decide their political future because of those robber barons taking control of Hawaii. And McKinley didn't do much to stop the robber barons either. So, okay, now we come to maybe the most likable or most fun or entertaining president in U.S. history, and that is definitely Theodore Roosevelt. And I really need to get a mouse for this computer, so I'm sorry here. But he's going to just stay there for a little bit as we transport him to the S tier. So for me, these 3 presidents are probably the only S tier presidents. But Theodore Roosevelt basically broke the power of the robber barons, which had been indirectly controlling U.S. politics. By breaking the power of the robber barons, he opened the field to cooperation. He regulated industries. He brought about the end of trusts and conglomerates and monopolies. He gave workers their bigger say, their bigger rights. He purified the food. He created the groundwork for the FDA to purify food and drugs and products made in the United States. He also created the National Park Service. He negotiated the peace between Russia and Japan. He negotiated the coal miner strike. He created the nation of Panama by causing a revolution against Colombia just to build the Panama Canal, and succeeded where the French before them had failed. So Theodore Roosevelt obviously will get a ding on his legacy for his horrifying views about African Americans and Native Americans, basically believing the only kind of good Native American almost was a dead Native American, he once said. But as president, he did an extreme amount of good to progress America towards a more equitable society where more workers' rights, workers' opportunities. He laid the foundation for a more competitive market, a wealthier market, and a wealthier citizenry, and increased America's military strength through the growth of the big stick he referred to, the Navy, while also, of course, doing what he could to, you know, increase their international prestige by the building of the Panama Canal, one of America's greatest international efforts. So Theodore Roosevelt obviously is one of those presidents who deserves a lot of credit for what he was able to accomplish. So, yeah, I could go on and on. There's so many fun stories about him. I've got a bunch of fast facts about him on the channel, but he's on my shorts. But there's just so many fun things that he does and talks about. Or did. I mean, say the teddy bear gets its name from him. He hated being called Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, but was just a larger-than-life figure, perhaps the largest figure that when you consider aura to ever be U.S. president. Okay, William Howard Taft. So, I think William Howard Taft gets a bad rap. I like William Howard Taft. I think Theodore Roosevelt basically poisoned William Howard Taft against him and then poisoned his presidency. Taft was never able to strike out on his own. The division in the Republican Party allowed Woodrow Wilson to become president, who I'll talk about in a minute. But William Howard Taft did a lot to get rid of the monopolies and regulate corporations more than Teddy Roosevelt had, but just never stood a chance once he deviated from the Roosevelt platform and the Republican Party. The progressives never would have given him a chance, and he wanted to do right by his country. I think that puts him ahead of Taylor and Hayes to some extent. Probably should put Hayes ahead. No, I'd still keep Taylor ahead of Hayes. But yeah, so I like William Howard Taft. I don't love William Howard Taft. But I think he gets too much of a hard time. The idea that he got stuck in the White House bathtub and had to be lifted out is absurdly untrue, by the way. Okay, now we're on to the modern presidents. Okay, Woodrow Wilson. This is a guy who could get on the A tier of many historians, but not for me. I think Woodrow Wilson is not highly, but he's overrated. I think that when you consider the racist regressionism of the Wilson administration, when you consider his ties and allegiances formerly to the Confederacy and to the South, the playing of Birth of a Nation as the first film in the White House, the desegregation of the federal government under his presidency make a lot of sense. His greatest accomplishment is the fact that he won World War I. I consider it to be World War II, but he won World War I for the United States. The League of Nations was a disaster, to Wilson's credit. If the U.S. had been involved, they probably would have been okay. But I'm going to say that Woodrow Wilson really wasn't the president that America isn't the president that a lot of Americans think he was. The creation of the Federal Reserve continues to be a huge question of debate. Wilson vehemently opposed women's suffrage and things like that. And basically the cover-up after his stroke leads to the end of his presidency with a whimper, not a bang. He can't control that. But the lack of transparency from his wife to Vice President Marshall and to Congress really hurt him. His stubborn defiance to listen to the Republicans about the League of Nations kept the U.S. out of that. And his 14 points were very highly ideal and did a lot of good to promote democracy in Europe, but really did not address some of the bigger issues. And Wilson did warn the British and the French about punishing the Germans, which would indirectly lead to the rise of the Nazis, although I think that's overblown historically. So Wilson was not quite the visionary people think that he was, but he did have some good things going for him, especially when a president wins a war, albeit even especially a world war. Yeah, that's not bad. Okay, Warren Harding, and may I welcome you to the D tier. A lot of people would put Warren Harding in the F tier. The reason I'm not going to do that is that Warren Harding had some successful economic policies. Andrew Mellon's handling of the tax structures brought more tax revenue than anything else. America rebounded after an economic recession at the end of Wilson's term. Another reason Wilson should not be as highly ranked as he is. But I would say that Warren Harding is... his biggest problem is his scandals. He clearly did not care about what he did when he was president, nor did he care about his Secretary of Commerce or other things like that, causing scandals and problems through their corruption, selling off government land for oil tycoons and the infamous Teapot Dome scandal. Harding didn't care about anything other than his image and his affairs. And I think because of that, he's one of the most indolent and, dismissible presidents. Calvin Coolidge, and of course he dies in office before he can really get going, but who knows how his presidency would have turned out. Okay, another underrated president is Calvin Coolidge, and he's going to go at the top of my B tier. Okay, Calvin Coolidge oversaw an America that was booming and successful. The reason I almost want to put him in A tier. The reason he's not an A tier president is Coolidge ignored warnings about loan and lack of regulations from his own Secretary of Commerce, a man named Herbert Hoover, who we'll talk about in a second. And that helped lead to the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and things like this. But Coolidge oversaw an extremely robust American economy, a peaceful and a peaceful time of great consumerism. It's hard not to put him in A tier. But yeah, he's definitely, I think, more on the underrated side. Okay, Herbert Hoover. So here's a guy who's an F-tier president, no doubt about it. Doesn't do anything, doesn't get the government involved, doesn't stop the Great Depression, instead just whines and blames everyone else. The voluntarism never came through like it wanted to. Herbert Hoover saved more lives through his actions in relief for the Belgians and the Russians after the First World War than any of these men. But that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about his presidency, and this inactivity in the midst of the Great Depression is just horrid, and is why FDR is so loved, is that he was so active after Hoover was so inactive. Okay, so FDR. So this is not me missing the ball. I don't believe FDR is an A tier or S tier president. I believe FDR is perhaps the most overrated American president. His successes in guiding the country through the Second World War are quite impressive until you realize that he gave a lot more to the Soviet Union than he probably should have, and felt that they were more of an ally than a user. And of course, the U.S. used the Soviets too. It's not like they were buddies. FDR realized near the end that Stalin had no intention of democracy or self-determination, Woodrow Wilson's ideals that Roosevelt held dear. He had no hopes for that in North Korea or in Eastern Europe, and so he realized he'd been duped, probably too late. Economically, and so obviously we benefit from FDR in this country, in the United States, because of things like Social Security, workers' insurance, the FDIC. These bumpers are, what are they called in bowling? That keep the ball from going in the gutter. Those things have kept the American economy on track and kept the American economy from going in the gutters when economic panic sets in, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. The workers' programs were not only unconstitutional, they did not solve the Great Depression. Most of the projects were temporary. They were nice ideas, but they really didn't get as far as you would have wanted, and many of FDR's policies, Franklin Roosevelt's, did not solve the Great Depression. Some argue that they actually prolonged the Great Depression. And it was Roosevelt turning and allowing the full weight of the industry through government contracts with companies like Boeing and Ford and GM to produce the military equipment for World War II, which required everyone to get drafted into the workforce. And when all the men went off to fight, women and minorities populated the workforces in places like Detroit and Chicago, which were booming, which allowed the American economy to skyrocket. in the early 1940s. So war solved economic problems, which it did for William McKinley, by the way. But Roosevelt's I think Roosevelt does a better job in the second half of his presidency than the first half, other than being perhaps a little too buddy with Stalin. So yes, I know that one is probably my most controversial take, but I don't believe Franklin Roosevelt. This is tough because we're not done, but I don't know if he's a top 10 president. In fact, I think it's close, but yeah. Okay, here's a president who I think is better than FDR, who is not talked about enough as much as his predecessor, and that's Harry Truman. Obviously, Harry Truman his legacy as president will always be scarred by the inability to win the Korean War, and also, did he make the right decision with the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Given the possibilities of land war in the Japanese archipelago and the loss of life for Japanese, Soviet, American, and British forces at the end of a war that had already seen tens of millions of deaths, as horrible as Hiroshima and Nagasaki absolutely were, and as much of a stain on America's international legacy and prestige as they might be to some people, I believe that Harry Truman was a good president. America was relatively prosperous. There weren't a huge amount of domestic issues. The baby boom started. The growth and prosperity of the middle class started under Truman. And of course, the decision to drop the bombs, although extremely controversial, was the right one. Truman also saw the rising perniciousness of communism with the Soviet Union and China. And I think that that he had a lot of foresight with the Truman Doctrine. And if you're thinking about it in terms, not ideologically, but in terms of America versus the Soviets, and whoever is helping the Americans win is a good president, Truman deserves a lot of credit there by keeping Turkey and Greece on the American side, even if Turkey became a partner of NATO, which made no sense. But Truman knew what he was doing when it came to foreign policy, particularly in Europe, Korea. The inability to end the war successfully and the fact the war lasted too long does hurt his legacy as well. Truman's also a delightful and fun character as president. He once got into a brawl, or just lambasted a critic from the Washington Post for lampooning his daughter Margaret's singing career. So, yeah, Harry Truman, fascinating guy, a president who doesn't get the credit he deserves. And here's a president who almost everyone agrees is underrated, and because of that, he is considered. He will go in my A tier. He is underrated to some extent, but I think everyone's talking about him so much that Ike, who we all like, because we all like Ike, should be an A tier president. Dwight Eisenhower built the interstate highway. He built up the American military arsenal in order to use mutually assured destruction to deter the Soviets from ever launching a land war in Europe. Eisenhower did what he could to help promote civil rights, and remained a proponent of civil rights throughout his presidency. America was prosperous and proud. He expanded Medicare and Social Security. He governed from the center, although with right-leaning tendencies. Did not do enough to corral rampant McCarthyism. Obviously, as Vice President Richard Nixon, being a Cold Warrior, kind of hurts his prestige a little bit. But Dwight Eisenhower is a president who is very well liked and very admirable in many, many ways. And America seems to have been very prosperous. And Ike was and things seemed very stable and healthy during his presidency, and probably could have done more to help civil rights, but for that time, that was more than most presidents before him had done. By the way, Truman gets a point in his favor because he desegregated the military, which I think puts him above Polk now that I think about it. But yeah, Dwight Eisenhower, the quintessential underrated president, to the point where he's not underrated at all, in my opinion. Okay, this man might be the greatest president of all time if he had not been assassinated, and that's JFK. And I'm going to put him behind McKinley because Kennedy, the Bios de Cochinos, Bay of Pigs, will obviously be his biggest mark against him. He did not support civil rights as much as he could have, but he was in favor of it. His foresight that the Vietnam War would be a disaster for the United States is obviously quite impressive. The fact that he stood up to the Soviets while also preventing nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis shows that he was a bright president. His ability to govern again from the center with tax cuts and things like that, but also with new government programs like the Peace Corps and his promise to put Americans on the moon by the end of the decade. Obviously, the creation of NASA was during Eisenhower's term, so that's a point in his favor. But Kennedy is definitely one of the better presidents America has ever had, and is one of those presidents where the prospects could have been, he could have done so much more if he had just had more time. So, yeah, I think that John F. Kennedy is, if he had been president for the 1960s, things would not have been as raucous. There would have been civil rights. There would have been the creation of the social programs of the Johnson administration without the controversies of the Vietnam War. Well, I'm here. I'm going to put. I'm going to make one more change. I'm going to put FDR ahead of James K. Polk. I don't want to be too mean. When you consider that Franklin Roosevelt was president 4 times for 12 years, he and won every time by a landslide, that obviously raises his stock a little bit. Okay, sorry, I know this is taking a while. We're almost done. My hope is to be done in under an hour. Lyndon Johnson. Okay. This will also land me in a little bit of hot water. I'm going to put him in C tier. The Vietnam War was a disaster because it was a war that was either winnable with total involvement and invasion of the North, or was not, or probably better yet, never should have happened. And Lyndon Johnson ramped up the escalation in Vietnam, never could win the war, and it tarnished his presidential legacy, no matter what his accomplishments with Medicare and Medi-Cal, or Medicaid, or whatever. Those achievements were obviously extremely important for American social welfare and give him a good nod. But some of his other welfare programs have been questioned as to their efficacy and their social impact. Johnson was not the racial progressive that people make him out to be, and probably supported civil rights for political purposes. He was a Southern Democrat after all, but his accomplishments in the civil rights front obviously are extremely good. So I mean, it's tough, but I just don't see him as a great president. And I think that the Vietnam War did more damage culturally than any other phenomenon of the 1960s. So yeah, there he is. Okay, Tricky Dick, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is going to be an F tier president, but I'm going to put him at the top of the F tier, and here's why. Now, a lot of people in recent years are saying Nixon did a lot of great things. Nixon did this and that. Yes, Richard Nixon did a lot of good. He created the EPA. He brought him into the Vietnam War with an official American win, although it was very much a Pyrrhic victory. And he stabilized a country that had gone through chaos in the 60s, only to bring it into more chaos with the Watergate scandal. Nixon's paranoia never relented him, and because it was never relented of. And believing a president is above the law, acting unconstitutionally, lying and covering it up, just made things worse. Nixon might have survived if he had just said, "Yes, we did this. I'm really sorry." But yeah. Which the Watergate break-in was totally unnecessary. Nixon won that election by the largest amount in U.S. history, population-wise and electoral college-wise, proportionally. So, obviously, I don't know, the Watergate scandal will always plague Richard Nixon's presidential stock. It is rising. He's not the worst president in U.S. history, but he's not a very good one. Okay, we're into the modern presidents, or close to it, so things might get more controversial. Some of my users lived through these presidencies. Some of them lived through the presidencies all the way back to maybe even FDR. So, Gerald Ford. Okay, I know that I've done a lot to the C tier list. I'm just finding out where to put him on the C tier list. I put him here. I'm going to shift Johnson to the top of the C tier list. Gerald Ford is one of those guys. I think no. He's never elected president or vice president. He wants to do right by his country, and things are actually pretty good under him. He brings some healing to the stagflation of the American economy. He negotiates the SALT treaties, the first SALT treaty with the Soviets, although they never followed the SALT agreements, the détente that started under Nixon visiting China, which is one of his biggest foreign policy accomplishments, puts Ford in a better position than Nixon. The pardoning of Nixon, in retrospect, was a good decision. Gerald Ford didn't do too much wrong as president, but he just wasn't the person needed at the time when people were questioning their own government and its efficacy. So for that, he's a mediocre president who just never had the oomph of a Andrew Jackson, a JFK, or a Harry Truman. So I know this list is controversial to say the least. Not everybody thinks that Harry Truman was a better president than FDR, and that Andrew Jackson is better than Lyndon Johnson. But C'est la vie. Okay, Jimmy Carter. This is an example, again, like most of the people on the D tier list, of a president who had good ideals, who never got off the ground. He did too much. He created the Department of Education and Energy. He believed that he had obviously won the presidency because he's a Washington outsider and remained an honest and transparent man. And obviously, Jimmy Carter, if we were grading personalities and behaviors, would be an S tier president. But his accomplishments as president are few and far between. The failures to solve the Iranian hostage crisis, the economic meltdown, the energy crisis, and all of these things he just couldn't solve. So Jimmy Carter gets a D tier. No disrespect to a man who seemingly had an incredible reputation. The destabilization, by the way, of the Middle East, which is going to really hurt some of the presidents coming up, started with Jimmy Carter, with the Shah of Iran. That was that was a missed call. Okay, Ronald Reagan. All right, this one might be the most controversial one on the list, and I can't avoid controversy, even though I'm skipping over Trump and Biden to some extent. I'm going to might as well just put him in the NA category for now. And that's Ronald Reagan. I mean, look, the ramifications of Reagan economics are continually being seen in the American economy. The war on drugs was an absolute failure. Reagan did not, or not an absolute, but it was a failure. It was a good intention that went bad. Reagan is not the only president who proposed it and pushed it, but it was not a, it was actually started in the 70s. Nixon kind of started the war on drugs, but Reagan's ideas around that turned out to be wrong. His inactivity with the AIDS crisis have hurt his stock. But when it comes to foreign policy, it's really hard to think of a president who was more successful in foreign policy. Other than Iran-Contra, Reagan, I think, is up there. It's, I don't know about top 5. Yeah, that's tough for me to put him in the top 5. In fact, if I'm going to skip around because I do have a top 5 list that includes Kennedy. It's tough for me. Yeah, because this is technically my top 5. Because none of these other guys are going to get anywhere close to that. I'm going to say, yeah, I'm going to put Reagan at an uneasy 5 with Monroe, Eisenhower, some of those presidents looking in. Yeah, I'm gonna leave Reagan there for now. The economic programs, in retrospect, have been highly criticized. At the time, they were very successful, at least in the sense of low unemployment. We've got this myth of the stocks and of Wall Street in that time period. I think Reagan does get a lot done domestically. I think foreign policy, Reagan did what no president had done in 50 years. He stood up to the Soviet Union, called them out for what they had done, and succeeded in undermining them. And eventually, with the help of Gorbachev's more lax policies, started their complete final downfall. So I think that Reagan, his Cold Warrior efforts, put him above a lot of other presidents, and that's going to be a tough hill for me to fight from sometimes. But I'm going to have to put him there. Let me see here. George Bush. People say George Bush is the best president who only had one term, and I agree, except for Polk. Bush definitely is successful. He looks at he kind of plugs the holes in the weaker parts of the Reagan economy. He finishes off the Soviet Union. He wins the Gulf War. His lie about taxes and a third party challenge really hurt him when it comes to getting a second term. But he's not a bad president at all, and is really one of the last presidents who's not on the celebrity basis. This thing that started with Reagan being a celebrity, Bush doesn't have that going for him like other presidents did. So I gotta like George H.W. Bush. And I'm going to make one more change. I'm going to put Lyndon Johnson ahead of Wilson and Bush. This is tough because I know I make the list and I think back on it, and I'm doing this live as I think about it. I'm going to move him back down. Bush won a war. Wilson won a war. Jackson won a war. Polk won a war. FDR won a war. Johnson did not. I know that seems mean, but not at all. So yeah, here's another president who is knocking on the door of the A tier, and this is gonna make if my pick of Reagan in the A tier made conservatives mad, my pick of Clinton in the B tier is going to make if my pick of Reagan in the A tier made liberals mad, my pick of Clinton in the B tier is going to make conservatives mad. And here is why. I think Clinton is slightly underrated as a U.S. president. I think America was prosperous. Things were pretty stable. NAFTA, things like this, greater globalization of the American economy, the internet, all of these things come about because of Clinton's relatively fair-minded approach to the president, to governing as president. He was a reform-minded man. He was politically savvy. I know there's a lot of questions around his personal character, which obviously, with every right, we have to question corruption as well as philandering, which is more obvious. The Monica Lewinsky scandal keeps him from the A tier. But no, I don't think Bill Clinton is a bad president, and I don't think there's really much. The first strike initiative was not a good idea, but other than that, I don't think there's much that Clinton does that puts him in a bad way compared to, say, Lyndon Johnson with all the cultural decay in the Vietnam War, or Franklin Roosevelt with the mixed review of the Great Depression. Oh, by the way, another thing about FDR, I'm sorry, I know you're not going to like hearing this. FDR put the Japanese in camps, refused to sign anti-lynching legislation. There are many reasons why FDR doesn't deserve the reputation he gets. Just had to say that because I know there's going to be people who are pointing out that FDR's policies did solve the Great Depression, and that's a debate for another. That's really been settled that it didn't. It might have hurt it, but even if you love everything FDR was for, you can't love the Japanese internment and other things like that. But Clinton doesn't quite have that to his name. I think things were prosperous for Bill Clinton. I think things were pretty good under the Clinton presidency in the United States. He's the only president in modern American history in the last 40 years, thanks to Reagan's spending to balance the budget. So I got to go with him there. And look at that, James Monroe is still in 6th place. No one's going to agree with that, but that's why the more history you learn, the more complicated it becomes. Okay, I don't want to judge these two men. Because I think that these two guys, it's almost too soon. I think George W. Bush is the Jimmy Carter of his era, and a guy with good ideals who wants to do the right thing. Exporting democracy sounds nice for countries that are used to democratic experiments, but it doesn't work in Iraq and Afghanistan. And because of the failures of his wars, I'm going to put him behind even Warren Harding. Bush's economy collapses. Everything tanks and goes wrong for George W. Bush. Being a nice guy is not enough. And that's true for Benjamin Harrison. That's true for Jimmy Carter. It's true for George W. Bush. Being a nice guy and a good speaker is not enough to put Barack Obama in the A tier. And this might be controversial. Conservatives obviously think he was terrible. Liberals obviously think he was great. And in my opinion, he's just meh. Barack Obama really, other than the ACA, which has had mixed reviews, but is a step towards a universal health care that many people believe that America needs, Barack Obama is a mid-tier president. Things were not great under him. Things were better economically from the Bush failures of 2008. But I just don't see Barack Obama as that great of a president. He was a very, very good speaker, but that's not good enough to make you a great president. I mean, just because you're a great speaker doesn't mean you live out those ideals that you speak. I mean, some of these presidents have reputations for being terrible speakers, yet they're great presidents. Silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge himself. Yeah, I'm not saying Obama was bad. I'm saying that it's almost impossible for me to put Obama in a tier right now. Yeah. So I don't know. Things weren't terrible when he was president, but they weren't great. The Arab Spring, the continual dissemblement of the Middle East is causing huge havoc, has led to huge refugee crises, and Obama did not help that. Egypt, Syria, and Libya, the failure to get out of Afghanistan, these things will haunt his foreign policy legacy. And even his own vice president, who became president, blamed the problems in Russia and Ukraine on his predecessor, believe it or not. Okay, I'm going to just say this. If I had to put Joe Biden in a category, I'd put him in D tier. The reopening of the economy after COVID is obviously a good thing, but Joe Biden was I don't like saying this, but Joe Biden was too old to be president. And I know Reagan probably had Alzheimer's in his last couple of years, and I put him in the top 5. I know that. I'm very well aware. But Joe Biden clearly had mental acuity issues in 2019 and 2020 when he was in the primaries. He never should have been the Democratic nominee. The Democrats rallied around him thinking, because it's been the only Democratic political strategy that seems to have worked for their base, at least over the last 10 years, is stop Donald Trump, stop the Orange Man. And Joe Biden was likable and well known enough to do that, and he did. Reopening the economy after COVID, good decision. The mishandling of the issues in Ukraine, Gaza, all of that stuff, the continual problems at the southern border. Joe Biden's really, and then the absolute proof on a debate stage that he was mentally not what he used to be, and not sharp enough, and clearly not up for the job, really damaged his presidential legacy. But it's too soon to tell. Biden had a lot of political experience and political wisdom that might, retroactively, be true about certain things, but he clearly didn't get off the ground the way he should have, and it's not the media's fault, because the media protected him every step of the way. It's not Trump's fault. Trump didn't have the political power like Andrew Jackson did to ruin John Quincy Adams, although there are a lot of parallels between them. But yeah, if I were to put Biden anywhere, I'd put him probably in the middle of D tier. And then there's Donald Trump. I would also put him in, this is tough, I'd put him in D tier. And the reason I'd put him in D tier is it's not the policies, it's the January 6th, it's the election denial, it's things like that that are stains on his legacy. If his platform of domestic production and manufacturing can work, and that Americans can survive the worst brunt of the tariffs, then Trump could jump up a couple of tiers. It's really hard to have somebody so brutish be in a high-ranking position, but hey, look at Teddy Roosevelt, look at Andrew Jackson. These are high-ranked American presidents, and they did not mince words. Neither did Harry Truman. Bill Clinton has his problems and his baggage. Reagan, Kennedy, a lot of these men have a lot of baggage. But anyways, so yeah, that is my list for U.S. presidents. And yeah, one more thing. Trump wouldn't be in F tier because of his successes in his first term. American economy is pretty stable under Trump, and COVID was the thing that did him in. So I wouldn't say he's an F tier president. We'll see what happens in these next 4 years. And Biden, it's too early to judge, and these two men obviously died too early in office to really get anything done. But yeah, take a picture or a screenshot, it'll last longer. I hope you really enjoyed this. This was a lot of time and everything. It was over an hour. So usually I only do like 5 to 10 minute videos. But I said I would do a tier list, so I did a tier list, and there you have it. The 45 men who have been U.S. president, the 47 presidencies of the United States, tier ranked with 4 exceptions based on 2 of them not being president long enough, and 2 more just too early to really judge them. So I really hope you enjoyed this. If you did, consider liking and subscribing. Leave a comment and feedback. Tell me who you think was the best president, or where am I wrong? Where am I right? What could I do better? Really appreciate your feedback. Consider liking and subscribing. And I hope you have a great week ahead of you. And I will see you on Friday when we do a long-form video. I'll probably do a tier list on the English monarchs, because I usually do English monarchs and U.S. presidents, because I've got a lot of knowledge there and stuff like that. At least I think I do. So maybe after watching this, you're not so convinced. But yeah, take care. I hope you have a great week. And remember, love history. Bye-bye now.